Hello all. Welcome to the Global Impacts of COVID-19 webinar series. My name is Wendy Hunter Barker, and I'm an Assistant Dean here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Today we're going to talk about domestic unrest in the US, but before we do that, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how GPS collaborates with our partners around the world. With a historical emphasis on the Pacific, you can see we have many partners in China, Japan, and Korea, as well as Mexico, Chile, and Brazil. These partnerships allow the free exchange of students and faculty for short visits and the flow of intellectual capital that comes with close collaborations. But we're expanding this list every day, and as our faculty research focuses on places like India and Africa, the EU, this list continues to grow. The trend is broadened by the regional scope of the school that's evident in this slide, which outlines a snapshot of some of the field work faculty are involved in. You can see the myriad of studies around the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. One special multi-partner collaboration we are excited to discuss is the new International Institute for Economic Diplomacy. Together with the OECD, the International Economic Forum of the Americas, and the 3 universities you can see here, this joint effort aims to substantially increase the body of knowledge around economic diplomacy and to offer professional and graduate training from the top practitioners in the field. But today, as promised, we're sticking closer to home. We have an amazing group of speakers, the majority of whom are editors for the award-winning blog, Political Violence at a Glance, which is supported by the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, which is housed here at GPS. Barbara, if you're ready, I will turn off my share screen and turn this over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Hello, everyone. We're thrilled to have you here. I'm thrilled to be here. If I wasn't actually on this panel, I would be listening in on it because I don't know what we're going to say or what my panelists are going to say, but it's going to be a really interesting hour. I'm a political scientist here at GPS, and what I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. It's called COVID and Domestic Unrest in the United States. Basically, my job is to introduce the speakers, to launch the discussion with a question, and then to gather questions from the audience and pose those to our panelists. So let me introduce the people we have here. Some of you may know them. They're all quite famous. Some of you may not, and you should know how special they are. I'm going to start with Erica Chenoweth. She is one of the world's leading experts on civil resistance. Actually, she is the world's leading expert. I shouldn't qualify that. She holds an endowed chair in human rights and international affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. In 2013, she was named one of the top 100 global thinkers. She is probably the most perfect person to talk about what's happening in the United States today in terms of the potential for resistance, the potential for violence, and what we can do about it. Christian Davenport is, he is one of the leading experts on social movements. He is the world's leading expert on government repression. He is a political scientist at the University of Michigan. He's also an associate at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Norway. I was going to tell you about some of the books he's written, but he has written so many of them that it would take up too much time. So Google Christian Davenport. That's all I have to say. Joe Young is, he's a political scientist and he is chair of the political science department at American University in Washington, D.C. He is a leading expert on political violence. He is also a consultant for the Department of Defense on countering violent extremism. And then there is our very own Jesse Driscoll. He's a political scientist here at GPS. At UC San Diego. He is an expert on state building after Civil War and on various dynamics associated with Civil War, including how and why militias form. I have a special thank you to Jesse. He is the one who came up with the idea for this webinar. It would not have happened without him. So thank you, Jesse. I love all of you. I've known all of you for years. I could have very long conversations with all of you. I know how precious your time is, and that taking an hour out of your time is a really great gift. So I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to launch right in. The format's going to be pretty simple. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes. The goal is to make this a conversation amongst us. I really want to see what people have to say. I haven't given anybody any questions. They don't know what I'm going to ask. They were asked not to prepare any notes or any formal responses. They know so much that we'll just see what part of their brains they're going to share with us today. You are welcome as audience members to send in questions. I can't guarantee that we will get to all of them, but if you ask a really good question, I'm going to try to ask it. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of context about why we're talking about domestic unrest today. I think one of the big surprises for many Americans, some Americans, but probably not all Americans, was that American citizens reacted very differently to COVID, not physically, not from a medical perspective, but in terms of how they reacted to it and what they thought the government response should be, based on whether politically they were on the left or on the right. And one very clear example of this was the anger on the right about governments, the federal government and various state governments shutting down businesses. In Michigan, for example, the Michigan militia went to the state house in the Capitol and they demanded entry. They were given entry into the Capitol, despite the fact that many of them were openly carrying firearms. And they demanded that the governor open up the state. The government didn't accede to these demands, but it gives you a sense of how this particular issue has been politicized. So I'm going to start with Erica, and I'm going to ask a very quick question. Is what we're seeing, this response, is this a typical type of nonviolent response, nonviolent protest, or are we beginning to see something new emerge?
Good question, Barb, and thanks for convening us, and thanks to all of my dear friends and colleagues for being here. So I've been reading this book by Frank Snowden called Epidemics in Society. And in that book, he makes clear that during every period of an epidemic, there have been varying social responses. There have been people who resist restrictive measures, seeing them as either overbearing or essentially allowing too much accretion of state power. And there have been those who have protested over perceived inaction, lack of public safety measures, and lack of ability of their governments to intervene effectively. So what I think we see here is in some ways representative of the processes that unfold in the context of epidemics, but I would say that it has its own American flavor because in this sense, it is combining with the existing kinds of polarization that have been dominant over the past number of years, as well as real and sincere grievances over the inequalities that have long existed here and that are now being brought even more into light with the effects of the pandemic having such unequal effects across our society. So it has a sense of continuity in terms of the pattern of protests and counter-protests, but it also intersects, I think, with some of our own social problems that are unique to our time.
Yeah. So you can't talk about the response to COVID without talking about race. It's disproportionately affected African Americans and Latinos. They're the ones who are dying at much higher rates. And the irony there is that the people who are generally protesting are people who come from rural areas that are less affected by it. They are almost exclusively white. Most of them are male. And so I wanted to ask all of you, but I'd love to hear Christian's view on this. To what degree does race play a role? And do you think our president, President Trump, would have reacted differently if the pandemic had disproportionately affected rural whites, or let's just say whites, rather than members of minority groups?
I got something. I mean, so I'll respond to the Black thing second. So one, I don't think we can talk about protests without talking about repression. So I think those two are intricately connected. So I can't kind of like accept the premise of the question. And I don't know that it's nonviolent when people walk around with machine guns, loaded or not. So I would question whether or not it's nonviolent. And so why aren't you seeing Black folk upset and out and protesting in larger numbers given the kind of dynamics? I'd have two answers. One, we're used to dying disproportionately. There's a huge variety of different things that we've been assaulted with, and unfortunately we break them up. So it's driving while Black, running while Black, going to the hospital while Black. Put that all together, it's suffering from racism and white supremacy. And those are not new. And unfortunately, we're still kind of dealing with that. A new generation has emerged to talk about police violence, but that goes back as well. I've seen reports from the early 1900s where the NAACP was had a report on Black violence. So that's also kind of similar and comparable in many ways. And so we still see kind of the manifestations of that going on. What I find interesting is your Trump question, right? Would things be different if it was rural white folks that were dying? I'm like, this gets back, like everybody could chime in with this for, help me out with the data, but it's like, I don't know that he's got a greater affinity with white working class people or poorer white folks than anybody had. I thought that it was disproportionately that white people were voting for him, which was kind of like but is he more sensitive to them? I don't necessarily think he'd be any more sensitive to that community dying either, given kind of like where he emerges on the kind of capitalist sensitivity spectrum for those that are suffering disproportionately from capitalism. I think that's a broader point.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, I guess. I mean, I think that the kind of rise of white working class identity is one of the more discouraging trends of the last 5 years. I think a lot of people attribute it to Trump, and I don't think that that's quite right. I think that it's closer to the truth to say that he has really benefited from it. But the idea that there are really a lot of people out there who are beginning to see themselves potentially as a class or as a unified group with special interests that ought to be taken seriously, I think a lot gets loaded into white supremacy that because of the history of race relations in this country, and the idea that there's a large block of people that are at risk of losing their socially privileged dominant position, and with cause, think that that's going to happen, and they kind of are projecting the future onto the present. I think that that's a dynamic that has led to a lot of anxiety, and there's obviously a racial dimension to the American history of race relations. I don't need to get into it with you guys, but or to the audience here. I mean, I assume that we're all educated about this stuff, but it is discouraging. And I think that it might well be structural and difficult to undo. Trump, I don't think, if there were different demographics to the death, I think the incompetence of the government response in the opening stages would have been, I think, pretty much the same. But the messaging and the kind of institutional response might well be different. It's a tough counterfactual. We're all just speculating about that.
Yeah, Erica?
Yeah, just really quick, I wanted to kind of riff off something Christian said too. First of all, I totally agree that just because nobody got killed when Michigan militia members were occupying the State House doesn't mean it wasn't a violent event. It was definitely an armed takeover of a public building. And those have been happening with increasing frequency over time in this country. not just during the pandemic. And since Christian didn't mention it, I just want to call your attention to two of his research works that really help us understand what so many people are now acknowledging on social media and elsewhere about the double standard between how we represent certain events as nonviolent or violent, depending on the race of the people protesting and the race of the people policing them. And one of them is by Christian, Sarah Sewell, and I think David Armstrong it's called Protesting While Black. It's a really important piece that talks about the effects of the race of the protesters on the way the public sort of defines and understands the events and the level of repression against the protesters. And the other one is with Dave Armstrong, I think, and Rose McDermott, which is based on like a survey experiment that helps us understand that when the protesters are Black and the police are white, that people are overwhelmingly supportive of repression against them, or violent repression, even when the Black protesters are using peaceful methods. But that can become more complicated if the protesters are white or if they're mixed in race, in which case the public is much more confused about who's to blame and whether to label it as nonviolent or violent. So this also then gives us a little bit of an opening for understanding how important it is for white people to stand with Black people when they are being assaulted, because it does change the way that the public understands and narrates the nature of the conflict.
Yeah. So that, Erica, that actually brings up a really good point. The protesters are almost exclusively white. They are being given access to the State House. They are basically being forgiven by our president. The way that the government has responded, I'm going to characterize it as perhaps with kid gloves. What does that mean in terms of where this movement goes, the alt-right movement goes? Does that mean that it's likely to be sort of steady state? Will that instead accelerate it? Are we more likely to see violence given how the government has responded? Are we less likely to see violence? So these groups are being treated in a very particular way. And is it likely to embolden them, or what effect do you think it's likely to have?
I'll jump in, although you directed that to her. Just, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut off Erica or anything. Quick response is like, I seem to be just in objecting to Barb mode, but I'm like, I don't know that I would narrow down the protests of these white militias and the open the economy back up people and say that that's the only contention going on. I think the crazy response we see of protesters in Minnesota is in part a response of the context of COVID-19. So I think it's more like it's contention in America that's affected by this behavior. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired dynamic times 10 because of all these other kind of like daily kind of problems that they're having. So I think both the protest to it and the police response to the protest to it, despite not having direct connections to, no one was out there saying COVID-19, they're wearing masks, and we've now been living with this for a couple of months. So I think that was kind of embodied within that. So I would definitely, I think I have a more encompassing view of the contention that is relevant for discussion. And notice those are Black folk, and then you have white folks asking to open up, where black folk clearly wish to open up. Latinos, anybody who's living marginally, right, and basically is not generating any cash whatsoever, I'm sure they want to open up as well. And so it's interesting to see exactly how that's getting spun. But I kind of wanted to not recast the discussion, but anyone remember Bluestone and Harrison, deindustrialization of America? I'm like, that's the inflection point for me. Deindustrialization started, a whole bunch of people started losing steady jobs, and then they're just kind of like sitting in the economy and sitting within the nation, and we just kind of let that fester. And that's white, Black, Latino, Asian, everybody. But how that got characterized within each community is interesting, and that has manifestations for the lack of interconnectedness that we're seeing now, because not everyone's seeing that as being an inflection point for why we're in the situation that we're in, and then exacerbated by COVID. I see COVID more as the kind of like grand revealing behind the curtain, kind of like Wizard of Oz kind of thing. Oh, and if you weren't paying attention, whoosh, that's what's going on in America. And now we're kind of like looking around going like, wow, why everyone's so vulnerable? Everyone's living paycheck to paycheck. What's going on? And that I think is a fascinating moment, but it speaks to which communities we're looking at and which ones we're seeing that are mobilizing, which ones that are not mobilizing. Because I put the mutual aid kind of movement actually out there as much, if not more so, than some of this isolated, contentious things. And I'd like Erica to speak to the whole thing about like the size of these protests that I've seen. I'm just like, they look kind of small. And then the majority of the population still is kind of like compliant. So I'm just kind of like, I'm wondering if the news coverage of it didn't help exacerbate it as well, right?
Yeah.
Just really quick, I wanted to speak a little bit to some of the escalation question, and I also want to hear what Joe and Jesse have to say about these too. But you know, I can imagine a couple of different processes. The first is a process where that Joe has done research on, certainly, where there's state repression, and then against, you know, what otherwise might be nonviolent protest by folks in general who are observing social distancing now, but are coming out in key moments to express dissent and who will be, you know, potentially repressed, that can sometimes create escalation effects, and there can be some escalation of violence in those contexts. This is often how civil wars start, actually, as the sort of precipitating events are an increase in nonviolent mobilization that's brutally repressed by the state, and then there's a small segment of people that think they must take up arms. I don't know that that's the context we're in this country right now. But the other one that is maybe closer to what we're in is where essentially militias and kind of pro-government militias start to become more incorporated and organized by the state. You know, you said sort of President Trump forgave the armed protesters, but I'd say he actually encouraged them, right? He had these tweets that were calling for the liberation of these countries from democratic governors. And so this is a troubling trend that a number of people who've studied white nationalism, white supremacy, and the alt-right in the United States have been noticing and expressing concern about since Trump was inaugurated. And so, you know, that I think is another process where you actually have kind of state co-optation of otherwise autonomous armed groups that then engage in different vigilante actions toward others in the country, and that then can also have escalation mechanisms. And the third kind of escalation would be outbidding, which could happen if there's much more competitive dynamics, say between right and left, where people, small kind of fringe movements think they have to outdo one another by starting to ramp up violence. And, you know, that's a process, for example, that Italy experienced during its democracy crisis in the 1970s and 1980s, that nearly brought down the Italian government numerous times. And so there are some kind of troubling precedents for the outbidding and the escalation of violence on both the right and the left. But again, I think the second dynamic is the one that more people are worried about, in part because I think it can have more devastating effects on communities if they aren't equipped to protect themselves and have no meaningful institutional safeguards for their rights.
Let me ask another question.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely, Joe.
I mean, one thing I think we should highlight real quickly is just that I don't think these protests that we're seeing around the quarantine are all that novel. I mean, I think they're quite similar to what we saw in the Tea Party. You know, there's nationalist rhetoric, anti-government rhetoric, pro-gun rhetoric, white nationalism, conspiracy theories. Is not all that new. What's new is the anti-quarantine piece, but that's just kind of like, you know, in a similar, when you've seen a protest and you have a million different signs, anti-quarantine is one of those signs. So in some ways, I don't see it all as that new. What I see is kind of, and it's not necessarily novel either, but it's troubling, is the fact that they're threatening violence. And you don't bring a gun to a protest and occupy a state building and then think that's nonviolent protest. That's, you know, by most definitions, that's terrorism. you're using violence to, sort of push your political cause. And whether you're just threatening it or using it, it's still kind of what most scholars would call terrorism.
So Joe, do you think COVID or this particular crisis is acting as an accelerant for these groups? And it is sort of a grab bag of groups on the right with different issues. Is it an accelerant? Is it, or, will things just kind of, once the vaccine is around and people can go back to their normal lives, will it just go back to, what it was?
I think there's always this undercurrent within American society. We have this tension that, Robert Putnam and other folks have talked about as sort of communitarian feelings in the United States versus more individual feelings. And there are folks who think this is the violation of their individual liberties, and that all ties in with guns and what have you. And I don't think it'll ever go away. I think we'll always have this tension. It's always a question of kind of the proportion of people who are in this space and then the proportion of those people who are willing to use violence. And I think, what worries me, and maybe this is foreshadowing, but what worries me is what will happen kind of post 2020 election, because I think most likely that group is going to lose electoral power and what the things that could happen post the election.
Okay, this is Jesse. Do you think Trump will lose the election?
I have no idea. And I do share Joe's anxiety, though, about regardless of who loses, the losers are going to be spitting mad. And I think that that's a existential concern for me at this point, to be honest with you. I want to add 2 points that I think are complementary with everything Joe said, which I completely agreed with. The first is that if you want to think about the scholars who have been doing kind of big think since Trump about global populism, Engelhardt and Norris is at the tip of my tongue because I just taught it last night. They draw attention to psychological variables about whether people, all of these arguments about threat perception have cognitive antecedents, right? So do people actually perceive their physical security as threatened, and do people perceive their economic security as threatened? We spend a lot of time on the COVID conversation focused on the latter, the physical security, because Black bodies are dying, are dropping, or whatever, and then are they Black bodies or they're white bodies? Does it matter? The conversation goes in a very predictable direction. That links in with the police violence conversation and a lot of other things that we're comfortable about. I don't think that many people have really gotten their heads around just what a global economic depression is probably going to look like. And if you want to think about not just the physical security, which Engelhardt and Norris talk about, but the economic insecurity, which is going to fall in the plate of whoever wins the election. Leaving aside the anger of the losers, the economic problem of how to handle a tax and transfer system afterwards, I think it's just going to be a very difficult redistributive politics problem. And all of the emotions that get poured on top of that are like gasoline on a fire. But the fire is also real, very real. And I think, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think people have these concerns about what is coming in the future, and they're projecting those concerns back onto the present. And so all this sort of slow moving resentment over status hierarchy stuff, that's a glacial speed set of demographic transitions, which I think maybe cause white people anxiety, some white people some anxiety. I'm not a specialist in this space, but the economic problems are going to be much more short term relative to that.
And what are the implications of those economic problems, Jesse?
I think a lot of people are going to get kicked out of their homes. Don't you?
I think we're going to have a lot of unemployment for a long period of time, and we're going to have much deeper poverty here in the United States. Yeah, and it's going to affect particular subsets of the population in ways that aren't easy to fix.
And are fairly easy to predict in advance.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, what's kind of frustrating in many respects is that the condition of unemployment itself or worsening economic conditions for folks does not automatically lead to mobilization, right? Because first, individuals are kind of like, they're individualizing it, right? I can't get a job because I suck. I can't do this because of my personal situation. So we're very bad with kind of like that collective sense of getting an idea of kind of like why we're in the situations that we're in. Angela Davis had this interesting kind of like comment once where it's just like, why are we all upset with people coming to this country when the United States government and the companies associated with it are responsible for devastating the economies in these places that people are coming from? So it's like, we have no sense of this kind of like broader system, and thus people can wallow in poverty for quite some time without taking any action. And political scientists seem to be like surprised by it, but like you can go to Olson, you can go a bunch of different ways to kind of explain exactly why we don't have the mobilization. But there's this piece on like framing political opportunity structure that was like neglected in this, I forget the volume, whatever. But the whole point was like, you could have the political opportunity structure moving in a particular direction, but if it's not framed in a way that people are actually understanding it and ready to mobilize around it, it doesn't make a difference. It's just sitting there latent. And so I think we're kind of very much in this context where we're lacking an ability and a language to discuss the very economic conditions that people should be mobilizing around. That's why I like the mobilization of these kind of mutual aid societies. It's just like people are dying, let's stop it. It's like, I don't know what to call it. I don't know what's going on, but I need this, that, this. Now, most people have not heard of a mutual aid organization. That's part because they're called a bunch of different things. And if you say mutual aid, then you're probably making some direct connections to like Kropotkin, and most people are going like, who is that? And so there's all these things that are going on and we're not quite there. But if we can provide a language for people to kind of like understand and aggregate, that would be very helpful, because a lot of stuff's gonna get worse, but we're not very good at trends. Like, for example, I love kind of the Southern Poverty Law Center, but I'm like, they're so fixed on like giving you what happens this year. Where's the trend? You know, everyone's talking about, are things getting worse? It's just like, I don't really want to download each year to piece it back together to then figure out the time series. Help us out.
So Christian, they're all of you, there's all sorts of groups, subgroups in the United States that are suffering. They're suffering in similar ways, some of them different ways, others, and yet they're not mobilizing equally. And what we've really seen, probably starting in 2010 and then accelerating since 2016, is the mobilization of the right. So moving forward, do you anticipate this being met by more mobilization on the left from other groups? Why is the right mobilizing more? In fact, if you look at some of the trends, the far left, extreme far left groups, including what used to be terrorist groups, have been declining significantly. They were a much bigger factor. They were the dominant factor in the 70s, and now they're almost gone, being supplanted by the right. So when we're talking about inflection points and mobilization, you know, why is it that the right is mobilizing and these other groups that are suffering are not?
I mean, my thing is, Obama helped devastate a lot of that mobilization, because a lot of the mobilization that was going up into that administration were just like, we won, we're good, let's go relax, we don't need to do anything. Completely forgetting the clue from the social movement literature is movements are good for getting things on an agenda. It's not good about talking about what policy looks like. It's not good on monitoring. It's not good in investigatory activities later or prosecution. And so movements need to be connected to these legal institutions and to lobby. I mean, all these things are interconnected. And so we're not seeing a movement because we're coming off the heels of 8 years of demobilization, and it's hard to gear these things back up. Consider whenever anything happens with Black folk, what do? They're looking for anyone that was connected to King. And okay, who was there? Who was on the balcony? Who was in the movement? And like, they have no clue of what's going on. That's when Black Lives Matter came out. They're just like, who are these Black people? They're just like, yeah, there's a bunch of other Black people too that are mobilizing. Let's try to learn the new generation. Let's go back again to the NAACP, right? So it's like people are still trying to catch up. And so the mobilization needs to kind of reemerge in many respects and be rebuilt. Black churches have been devastated over the past like 20 years in terms of folks having to move out of communities. And so that element or that cement for kind of getting people mobilized again is gone. And I'm not quite sure about, I mean, Jennifer Earle could speak to this. I'm not quite sure that the electronic explosion of Black people on Black Twitter and so forth is leading to people in the street around anything else other than policing. That's the interesting thing, right? So Black people can protest about policing. Any other topic, I think that there's going to be some difficulties there, because that's one of the things that we protested about a great deal. And thus the institutions are there, the rhetoric is there, the mobilization there, the clarity is there, the connection between protest and those activities. Other topics, a lot harder.
Erica?
Yeah, so I think that we've seen, I think Jeremy Pressman and I, in our crowd counting initiative, were able to, I think, reasonably argue that something like 7 or 8 of the largest single day demonstrations in US history have happened since 2016. So the left is not demobilized. It is incredibly fragmented and out of institutional power. And so that's, you know, why it doesn't look like they're mobilized, but they're actually, there's tons of mobilization happening. As Christian said, mutual aid pods are one of the most interesting things in terms of substitution and adaptation of techniques of mobilization that have taken place. It's actually, many people find it especially promising because developing mutual aid networks is often a way of building collective community organizational power that gives people much more resilience for longer term sustained mobilization, because it provides better channels for planning, training, preparation, and support when people are put in jail or injured or taken out of the scene for some reason because they need to take a break or whatever. So there's a lot that's going on that actually could conceivably build some kind of meaningful capacity for long-term transformation. But you know, there, like Christian said, my impression of the left over the past you know, 10 years is that there's been a real resistance to try to play an inside game and an outside game. It's sort of all outside game. There's a lot of fragmentation. There's single issue groups. The left is many different hundreds of organizations, local, state, federal, international, with no kind of movement of movements or grand coalition. The right is incredibly disciplined and organized, and they have had one goal since really the 80s, which has been, let's overtake every branch of government and make ourselves a permanent majority in the United States. It's in many different documents. And if they've sort of felt like if they can do that, if they get grassroots community support, that's how it's gonna lift them into these elected positions and appointed positions. But once they're there, they don't need an outside game. They just stay the inside game and keep others out. And I think that's part of the strategy. It's been explicit. So, you know, I think the question for the left then is, how does this kind of movement of movements emerge and try to protect what institutional access remains so that they can try to play the inside-outside game?
So we are now in our period of questions from the audience, and I have a whole bunch that I've been looking through, and I'm just gonna pick a few of them. The first one, hold on, they've added, hold on, sorry. I would like to hear any of the panelists speak to the longer term potential for unrest once the easy targets for demonstrators' ire, such as statewide stay-at-home orders, disappear. If unemployment persists, the economy deteriorates further, and easy rallying points like stay-at-home orders aren't there to focus discontent, what do panel members think the trajectory of domestic unrest will look like?
Jumping in quick, sorry.
Go ahead, Christian, and then Jesse.
Jumping in quick, I think partly it's a function of, again, right, I don't want to separate the protest from the repression part, or mobilization from coercion, but it's in part a function of where people are and what types of activities that the specific states are engaging in, right? So I don't remember if anyone's paying attention to, at the state level, states were taking various states were taking very strong stances against different forms of mobilization. And that's because they were either concerned with anti-drilling initiatives, or they were concerned with different types of people from the left coming out on some other type of activity issue. And so there's amazing variation with regards to how coercive the protest policing principles have been. And then there's different models at police stations. And so I think this is leading to part of the fragmentation, the difficulty in kind of like coming up with an overarching thing. We are seeing some variation with regards to how state authorities are setting up that kind of like that pitch for like different activists to kind of hit on, and not seeing the broader picture. That's why I'm like, you know, we need to kind of settle on kind of like what the overarching issue is, and the left has not been good about that since the devastation of these movements in the 60s and 70s, and there's not been a coherent kind of like replacement for it since then.
Jesse?
So, I mean, this is speculative, but my suspicion is that it will continue to be personalized in terms of the party that's out of power just attacking the president for, you know, kind of regardless of the identity of the president. I think that it's easy to focus on this particular president as a particular focal point, but that plays into, I think, a successful strategy, and oftentimes it seems like we're walking into a trap, we on the left. What do I mean? I mean that there's this narrative of contempt that I think is very prevalent in the Republican Party, which suggests that liberal elites, like all of the six of us, are actually not capable of articulating policy responses that fix the problem that the questioner asked. You know, that we're very, very good at a kind of magician's patter of explaining, you know, what people ought to be doing. But in terms of our behaviors, when we are in power, we don't do enough to actually help out the people who need helping. And that's a criticism that is fairly potent. And if you watch or listen to right-wing media outlets, the idea that you're being lied to is by people who have contempt for your values is I think what we're actually up against. On the flip side of it, I mean, I think that we are all we have a reflective narrative of contempt for some of the policies and personalities on the other side. I think this is pretty difficult to break out of, and I see it probably. I will be very pleasantly surprised if it remains nonviolent. I think that something that Erica said before that I really want to highlight is the possibility of outbidding, and if you give this enough time, extremes do like to play around with extremes, and so I just don't know over a 2-year period or a 3-year period if the trends that we've been talking about over the last 5 years are necessarily going to hold. I don't want to hog the mic anymore. I realize that there's kind of a
Jesse, you
a lot
can
to say. No, I'm the least qualified person to be on this panel. I'm just happy to be here, to be honest with y'all.
No, you always say interesting stuff. And I just wrote down extremes like to play around on the extremes. So I'm going to quote.
I stole that from Steph Haggard, man. You know, I just float around the internet repeating the last thing anybody ever said to me. That's my
Yeah,
goal.
Joe, you want to hop in here?
Yeah, I want to just jump in for a second, which is we know that one of the structural factors that, you know, struggling economies tend to breed more right-wing violence. And, you know, as we see the kind of as Jesse was talking about and Erica, that we'll see potentially this dynamic where the right sort of becomes progressively more violent, and then factions on the left respond and sort of counter outbid is not exactly outbidding, but sort of use violence in response. And those escalation dynamics worry me. I don't think, probably no one on this panel thinks that we're headed for a civil war. No country as strong as ours is likely to ever have a civil war. But I think what you can see is kind of more extreme violence, a la, you know, Oklahoma City, or events that are just much more brutal than we would have seen in kind of normal times.
I mean, not to deviate from being a political scientist for a minute and our focus on government and institutions, but I'm like, capitalism is the problem. It's been the problem and will continue to be the problem. And so, right, these little militias, okay, let's say they get exactly what they want. Okay, things open back up. We're still going to have the ridiculous amount of inequality we have in the country that is completely underestimated, and folks suffering from things faster or slower. I mean, like, there's a bunch of research that shows that African-American treatment within hospitals had been consistently negative before 2008, before this current crisis. I'm just like, okay, they're getting misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. They're not receiving meds because of perceptions of like, super strength and all this other craziness, right? So we have all these kind of activities that are just being like subject to different groups. And so I'm like, even if the right did get everything that it wanted, which is not clear what that is, they're still gonna have this fundamental problem of inequality and poverty to deal with. And how are they addressing that? And so the left had their shot, they couldn't address it either. So I'm just like, no one's fundamentally getting at what I think is at the core of this thing, which is capitalism is this like screwed over tremendous amount of population. And those folks are not going to like basically recover. They could be distracted. And that we could talk about various things and different policies that might affect some things on the margin. But unless we're gonna talk about fundamentally how we're gonna redistribute some stuff, then these folks are gonna suffer and continue to suffer, and largely in silence.
So this gets exactly at a question that we received from one of our former students. And the question is, why are these times not producing coordination and consolidation against a hyper-capitalist system that produces the crucial inequality in terms of power and wealth in the US that led to disproportional impacts of COVID-19? The question is, why is it not producing more coordination? Jesse?
Well, first off, I want Erica to answer the question.
She raised her hand. She's right after you.
Okay. So I would answer the question in the following way. I think that the left wing and the right wing of parties in this country, neither actually trusts the government to do tax and transfer honestly for different reasons. And I think that those reasons are actually pretty well rehearsed if you want to get into them. On one side you talk about regulatory capture, and on the other side you talk about structural grievances that never go away no matter what we do. And when Christian said before the left kind of had their shot, I think there's a lot loaded into that sentence. And so my impression, I don't watch a lot of Fox News, but my impression is that they don't actually regularly make a racial-based grievance statement. What they say is that our listeners out there are the working poor. And that just happens to coincidentally be working white poor. But that's a coincidence, right? It's the left that brings race into it. And then the right gets to ridicule that as saying, well, I'm not a Nazi, I'm not a racist. I'm just trying to keep up with health insurance costs or whatever else. And the failure of both parties to actually improve the lives of the median income in this country hasn't really budged since the 70s. And it's hard to know what policy levers we would pull to change that. And that's just leading to a lot of anger. So that makes coordination difficult. Like the fact that the elites don't actually have a clear answer to that question on the left, I think is a source of exposure to nihilists on the right.
Well, we're hoping Erica has an answer to that.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things. One is that there has been some attempts to reimagine what global economy that would be fair and just might look like over the past 10 years. And in some ways, the Occupy Wall Street actions were a sort of confluence of people who wanted to have that conversation. I would argue that global public awareness of inequality as something that is a household conversation almost everywhere now can be attributed to the fact that there was mobilization that was global and that was persistent and called attention to these issues in a way that no established political parties or insurgent political parties can ignore. But you also have to be able to imagine what the alternative system is and be able to articulate it with clarity. And it's always, it's always not a great day when you're quoting Zizek, but he did say something once that I totally agree with, which is that we can imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of capitalism. We haven't quite put to paper a compelling alternative that solves the problem without creating more problem on top of it that sort of time hasn't tested yet. And so I think it's in the works. I think that, divide and rule has been the way that working class solidarity has been broken over the past 100 years. Labor organizing unions have been busted. They're weaker now than they were. I think there's half as many people in unions today as there were 30 years ago. It's part of the way that the system works. But one other thing quickly, I just want to say on the last point about the sort of predicted rise in domestic unrest. I want to say it's really dangerous for us, as all of you have thought about, I'm sure, to speculate on the rise of violence, because that can initiate security dilemmas. So if I start talking in a way that expects violence to increase and others begin to expect violence to increase, then people start acting like violence is going to increase. And that means they start to engage in behaviors that look like self-defense to them, but to other people look like really offensive, dangerous, reckless, violent activity. And that can then lead other people to try to defend against that violence themselves, and then others interpret that as directly threatening to them. And so kind of what I think is really crucial is to make it an imperative for those of us who study contention to make sure that people are aware of the fact that violence is not the only way that people engage in dissent. There are many other realistic alternatives for how people can push their issues forward collectively and effectively without initiating these security dilemmas, even under very difficult conditions. And so to the extent that those types of alternatives can become more common knowledge, we can break out of security dilemmas, but not if we only think of violence as the only way people mobilize.
So I've saved the most important question for last, and it also happens to coincide with one of the questions we've gotten from our participants. And the question is this. Could you suggest ways that people and communities can work to de-escalate conflict in this country and polarization? And then the related question from one of our listeners was, what should donors and philanthropists do?
Well, I think one thing to do on a micro level is there's so much misinformation that runs around, and there's, conspiracy theories on both the right and the left. I mean, I spend most of the time at a micro level with my family, just dispelling the things that they're saying just that are factually inaccurate and are conspiracy theories, and trying to offer them alternative, like, this is fine that you feel this way, but this isn't based on any facts, and here's actual what's going on in the situation. And I know that doesn't necessarily solve any problems, but at a very micro level, to try and get people to have a basis to start a conversation.
Wow. And I actually want to get in on this. So there's a guy named Eric Liu, and he used to be a speechwriter for Bill Clinton back in the 90s, and he's basically spent his career talking about power, who wields power, how do you understand power, and he's created what he calls Citizen University to rebuild civics and an understanding of civics and an understanding of power here in the country. And he just wrote a book called You're More Powerful Than You Think, which makes a really important point, that if you don't understand how power is distributed here in the United States and who has it and how it works, by definition, you're giving your power away. And I think one of the potential ways that individuals, or at least at the individual level, that you can roll back the polarization and the tension is to simply understand how decisions are made and who makes them, and then become involved. And that it starts at the very local level, and then you think about ways you can scale that up. So that's my one interjection. Erica?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Christian.
The two things I was going to mention was in terms of like dealing with the polarization issue, I think individualism is the virus. We need to start to kind of like reformulate how we're thinking about stuff. I mean, like when I hear about kind of like how places like Norway and Norwegians were coming together to address certain types of problems and thinking about the kind of like individualistic orientation we had towards, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not wearing this damn mask. You can't tell me I can't do this. You can't tell me I do this. I'm just like, there's no sense of collective. And it's weird, right? Because the nationalism is about a kind of collective, but it's a certain group that's being kind of like invoked. So that was the thing there. With regards to funding, I'm just like, I think people need to start funding at more of the kind of stuff on thriving. I think that literature is, even if bad stuff happens, thriving is like one of the best things that you could try to do. Flourishing counteracts some of the negative activities, but we need to know more about how it functions and in what ways it functions in different locations. And then civil strategies of engagement, I think, are something that people need to fund. We just don't have enough, we don't have enough resources dedicated towards understanding. I mean, I'm not really a fan of VDEM, I'm sorry to say less publicly, but I'm just like, but one thing they have done is listed all the different ways that one could engage in the political system. And I'm like, okay, so I'm like, how do we engage in all these different ways? People don't really know that. They just think that I vote, I'm done. I sign a petition, I'm done. I go to a protest, I'm done. I'm like, well, okay, those are three activities of the whole repertoire of things that you could do in terms of engaging. And we don't really know exactly what leads to that kind of like robust sense of like political engagement. So if someone wants to fund something, they need to fund that rather than funding some of the stuff that they're funding now.
Erica?
Yeah, just on the first question about pathways out of polarization. I have to say I'm much more familiar with the literature on how we get polarized than how we get out of polarization. And my sense of the how we get out of it literature is that there are basically two pathways. One is that there are kind of sudden and decisive moves to the center. And the more common form is that there's a decisive victory by one or the other side that then basically realigns the system. And so I don't know, but what I would say is that if everyone in the United States thought of the most vulnerable person they knew and voted in that person's interests, we'd probably live in a much different country. And so that's one way to think about it if you're trying to be part of the solution. In terms of the donors and philanthropists, I love this question and thank you for asking it. I think there are a couple of things that feel to me to be urgent matters of undercapacity in our country. One is training and rapid response and conflict resolution and conflict de-escalation. The other is more for mutual aid networks. That is exactly what Christian was talking about, people showing up for other people and building their capacities to do that, especially in contexts where we have to be protecting ourselves and others against the spread of a virus. And then the third is convenings of people who've long been doing this work, who haven't had a chance to sort of get together, take a break, and think through how they want to proceed collectively in this sort of movement or movement environment. Like what would a large-scale coalition to build a more prosperous and fair society look like? Who can be part of that conversation? What can they bring to the table? And how are we going to proceed well beyond the 2020 elections? Because that's not going to fix it.
Joe, Jesse?
I hate to have to follow that, but I'll try. I want to echo the call for nonviolent intervention first responders, the people with particular kind of conflict resolution training who are also in a first responder capability. I mean, I think that would be a resource for a donor to consider funding. On the question of de-escalation, I think that if you want to think about a silver lining of COVID, it has had an obvious effect of changing the unit of analysis for a lot of people to the family unit. And I think that that might be, it runs in a slightly different vibe than the solidarity push that Christian is articulating. And I see a need for both sides. I think they can be complementary. But one of the arguments that if you want to think about a fundamental problem being the perception of white working class Americans as a group into itself that is falling behind in a status hierarchy, the solution to that is actually straightforward. It's to reimagine America in a way that there's like 70 different groups or 100 different groups, and it's just too cognitively complicated to figure out who is who. And I think that COVID could actually contribute to that. That all of a sudden, because everyone within their own micro bubbles can see how much diversity there is, even at the neighborhood level, I think that might have a silver lining to it somehow. And that's a slightly different direction than I think Christian was pushing it. I think there's an upside perhaps to individualism in all of this.
Joe, you're welcome to the last word if you would like it.
I'll just say something quickly, which is I think to get this de-escalation, I think it needs to happen also at the micro levels, like I was saying before, and that happens through persuasion. It'd be nice if there were more research on how we persuade people, and a lot of this is occurring via social media. I know that one of the splits we've been talking around in America is rural versus urban, and I think that's where a lot of this divide in this particular issue is. And how do we, in one situation, explain to the other situation what we're looking at, and then how we can persuade them that it's useful to think about it from this perspective.
Well, we are out of time. Let me just say thank you again to all of our panelists. This was really interesting. I was taking notes. I wish we could kind of go off into the bar next door and continue many of these lines of conversation, but we can't. I want to thank the people who joined us, and feel free again to email us if you have additional questions or just to say thank you. And that's it. Thank you, Wendy, for organizing this, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.